Hi. Hi, Larissa. It's nice to have you here. We're going to talk a little bit today about where we've come in the past 20 years in terms of the challenges the United States faces. And you've been paying attention to this for all of that time and even a little bit before. Yeah. And I think that's good. I think it's a good place to begin the discussion, which is it's almost, we have the national security structure that we have, the FBI strategies that we have, that you have. And the real question, I think, for many of us is what's changing right now? Where have we evolved to, and what are the new challenges? And I know you get asked that question all the time, but I'm really concerned with what do you see as the top order challenges right now and those that may have become lesser challenges that maybe began the century, particularly after the attacks of 9/11. And so if we could start there, just talk about the challenges you see today with an emphasis on what's new, what's different, what's evolving.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to be here and to have this fireside chat with you. It's always a great opportunity to get out and talk about the great work that the Bureau does and how it kind of impacts the rest of the community. In terms of how we've seen the terrorism threat evolve over the last 20 plus some years, it's fascinating because I remember back in the day as a baby agent, as a brick agent, where we would work, key threat actors such as Al-Qaeda, and then obviously the evolution of ISIS a little bit later, and how it was very easy to track these terrorists from when they would leave the United States and then they would go overseas, do training camps and learn, and then come back into the U.S. For the first time in Bureau history, we are fighting terrorism on a couple different fronts, right? Whether it's international terrorism, domestic terrorism, and state-sponsored terrorism. And I'm going to walk through each of those if you want. So from the international terrorism perspective, as I had previously mentioned, we see a shift from folks traveling overseas and being trained over there to this online scene where folks are consuming an incredible amount of propaganda that is readily available, and they're becoming radicalized online. And that makes it much more difficult to spot and identify these individuals who want to commit acts of violence, whether it's on U.S. soil or overseas. That online space is a very challenging area for us. Another area is the rise of actually juveniles. Thanks to COVID, a lot of folks, were cloistered in their houses, and as a result, they also consumed a lot of online propaganda. And it's not just propaganda, right? It's techniques, whether it's how to make a bomb in your mom's kitchen, or manifestos that lay out in excruciating detail, what accoutrements to buy, whether it's military issue socks or boots or other sorts of weapons. And then, just lightly touching on the domestic terrorism front, as you know, and as most of our audience knows, we do not investigate solely on ideology alone. There needs to be that additional requirement of an act of violence. This space is also very interesting because it's the same sort of online propaganda and whatnot. And then the third area, as I touched on, is that state-sponsored and enabled piece. And there was a case recently that happened over the summer where, we've got an Iranian national as part of the IRGC wanting to conduct a murder-for-hire plot against a former national security advisor on U.S. soil. And that is something that they have tried to do for a while, but the fact that, they'd actually identified individuals that are willing to do the plot, and we were able to disrupt them.
Right, so I think that's sort of the tip of the iceberg, but thank you for sort of laying that out. And I'd like to just follow up with a few questions. So one is that we've been talking about the move to lone actors for a long time. And so the question, I guess, is if that's really the case now, that what you're thinking is a number of self-radicalized, in a way, individuals here and elsewhere, in the United States and elsewhere. What has to change in terms of how the FBI thinks about going about this? Because, in the 1 decade ago, it was really a focus on allegiances, cells, swearing by oath, it was a group organized network structure. How does this change how the FBI thinks about how to find individuals who actually pose the threat of violence?
So the lone actor question is very interesting because, by its very name, they're alone. But there are always folks in and around them that probably have noticed certain pieces. Have they moved away from their friends and family? Have they increased particular sales? And the way we potentially identify those individuals is through partnerships, whether it's community outreach or partnership with key companies that provide the ability to track purchases of certain questionable goods. All of those pieces come into play. And then obviously foreign partnerships. Having access and placement into some of these forums where these individuals are becoming radicalized, or they're seeking guidance, or they're seeking help. That's another piece that we heavily rely on.
So I guess one of the questions is, in the United States, we read about the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, and others that are domestic violent extremists, but they are in groups. So how much is the lone actor on their way to joining a group, and how much is it actually the lone actor that will stay that way until they materialize some kind of form of violence? How do you conceptualize the difference of that?
Yeah, so we see two pieces, right? So we have the lone actors that are, inspired, or they're just consuming that propaganda online. That is one group. But then we also have folks that do reach out to other more well-known groups seeking guidance and pledging allegiance and going to training camps. And it's not just a US-based problem, because we also see folks reaching overseas to individuals where they get additional military training, or they're sharing propaganda, or they're sharing techniques.
So the lone actors reach out either at home or abroad. What about abroad reaching the United States? What about foreign terrorist groups from around the world reaching out inside the United States? We read about this. How much is this actually something that has an impact, that's actually effective in terms of radicalizing individuals?
So that is definitely happening. We've got folks, outside the U.S. borders reaching into the United States to inspire and motivate folks to action. Where the FBI has become very good at is because, as you know, a lot of countries within the last couple of years are shifting terrorism resources over to counterintelligence threats. And that's where the partnership piece becomes even more important, because it takes a community to identify these individuals. So whether it's, the FBI, through sources and methods, we identify individuals that are communicating outside or inside the U.S., it's important for us to share that information, with our partners, and then create that feedback loop to identify additional individuals.
Which brings us to another piece of the changing challenge, which is what we've been reading about for years and observing, which is the move from a focus on non-state actors to include a focus on state actors. And some of this takes out of the terrorism context into just the larger national security threats that are dealt with these days. And so I guess the real question is, where are we as a country and as a globe in thinking about the interrelationship between the terrorist threat, as we understand it, and the nation-state threat?
Yeah. So you bring up a really interesting question, this issue of, transnational repression, right? Where, folks from another country reach into the borders of the sovereign country to influence, to coerce, to muzzle, to silence folks that are speaking out against, the country that they left. They do it in a couple different ways. I'll put it into three buckets because I'm very visual. So the first bucket is on the cyber side. The second bucket is administrative, and the third bucket is more in person. In terms of cyber, we see that through the lens of cyber stalking, harassment, malware, as well as disinformation online to degrade an individual's what's the word I'm looking for? Credibility. On the administrative side, it's, we see that present itself in terms of, inhibiting their ability to go back to their country of origin, whether it's, holding passport renewals or driver's license renewals, or, seizing property within their home of origin, or seizing assets within their home of origin. These are all ways to influence or quell their message, quash their message. And then finally, in terms of the in-person, those are the most egregious, and that's actually, there's a recent case that I can think of a well-known U.S. citizen, a journalist, as well as a human rights advocate. We disrupted a plot where individuals were planning on kidnapping this person and, silencing their powerful message on U.S. soil.
And was this reported in the press?
Yes, it was. And that actually is the most powerful tool that we have in our toolbox, right? So thanks for reminding me. You know, calling out these bad acts and putting it to the forefront and putting it into the media ecosystem to have those conversations because it is important that we don't silence these courageous voices.
I mean, that's sort of an interesting thing, you know, the relationship with the press, the relationship with the media in terms of wanting the media to say, look what's happened, look what we're doing, and on the other hand, don't look too closely because we need to do what we need to do, you know, in our own way. And so, has there been an evolution of thinking about this, just in terms of bringing in other voices, bringing in the media, just sort of, has this changed, or where does the Bureau stand on this?
I think it's important that, you know, our core mandate is to uphold the Constitution and protect the American public. And how we do that is through that transparency and that process. And, you know, making sure that the cases that we bring are airtight, you know, founded in solid evidence that is gathered through lawful means. And that must, you know, withstand the pressure test of the U.S. court system, and by extension, you know, the public perception.
I want to turn to state actors a little bit and talk about sort of the larger state actors. Iran's been talked about today, China, Russia, and how the tools that are in the toolbox for fighting terrorism, as we've known them, are a little different than the tools that are thought of in terms of nation states and state actors. And I'm just curious if you could just share your thoughts on that, particularly in terms of a lot of that falls within the intelligence basket, right? The you know, preventive intelligence, much of which the FBI, you know, incorporated into its mission after 9/11, but it still seems to me different once you get to the state level. So how is this playing out, and is there a transformation inside the Bureau to deal with state actors, or is it really just using the tools and the structures and the offices that are already there to deal with the nation states?
So we have seen in the recent years a shift of pushing resources kind of into that place, and that's how we underscore our commitment, you know, to the counter-intel fight. We're with this shift of resources from, not necessarily from counterterrorism, but, you know, other threats that are out there. Obviously, the nation-state actor, you know, is one of our top priorities. Another thing is, you know, using intelligence tools. And, you know, those need to be carefully guarded. Those need to be within certain legal parameters. And kind of what I'm thinking of is our authorities to query under 702. And I think that's one of those pieces that, you know, has received a lot
Section
of...
702.
Section 702. You know, those are one of those things that has received a lot of public scrutiny. And the Bureau has taken steps to look inside holistically to make sure that we are following process. We are, you know, complying with all of the oversight boards. And we are also, I'm drawing a blank, you know, we're also, you know, when they come in and they actually check some to make sure that, you know, our queries are thoughtful and they're within the proper parameters.
There's been a lot of talk about, first of all, this is referred to as warrantless surveillance by many, and it's sort of this sort of massive collection of information, but also to the use of sort of backdoor uses of it, to sort of not what it was actually intended to do, or not what it is required by law to do. Do you think that the way forward is, 702 is up for reconsideration or review and renewal? And so the question is 702 something that can be presented in a way where people are ensured that the backdoor process isn't happening, that it actually does conscribe itself to the constitutional limits that you've talked about, or do you think it's kind of up for an entire rethink? What do you think about that?
I think where we're going to gain ground is providing the public with, and there's a little bit of a push and pull, with relatable, transparent examples of how we use it, right? Whether it's identifying, you know, critical child exploitation material that exists within that space, or identifying, you know, victims of massive cyber attacks. I mean, that's the lens on which we're currently using it. And then also being transparent in the number of queries that we do, or the methodology behind it, and the governance, and how we tightly control it now, you know, in terms of restoring the public's faith in how we, you know, exercise our authorities within this most precious tool.
Right. It's hard to fix something that already is kind of laid out like that. It's like, but it'll be interesting to see what happens, I think, in that forum. I want to switch a little bit, and this is to the nation-state question as well, sort of great power rivalries, is the economic the economic challenges in terms of economic espionage, in terms of just economic competition. How does this fit into the framework of what the FBI sees as the challenges lying on the horizon today?
Yeah, I mean, economic espionage is not a new thing.
No.
You know, it's always been important to protect each society's ability to innovate and to create, and then subsequently, you know, profit off of it to a certain degree. And, you know, back in the day, a lot of it was built on partnerships, and a couple different partnerships. Partnerships with private companies and partnerships with academia, and I can touch on a little bit on kind of how I see that. In terms of private corporations, you know, corporations are in this kind of push-pull where, you know, they are charged with, you know, shareholder bottom line, and they obviously wouldn't want to come forward if they suffered a breach or loss of intellectual property. Yet they do need us to actually investigate and bring those individuals to justice. And kind of how we get ahead of the curve on that is building that trust-based relationship where they understand that if they were to call the FBI, it's things that we can do and things that we don't do. And in terms of, you know, keeping information closely held, you know, identifying a perpetrator and then bringing them to trial, and then actually, you know, it coming to light. And, you know, building those relationships with key companies. And I will tell you, there is no company that is immune to theft of intellectual property. So we're seeing the petroleum industry, we're seeing the health industry, you know, whether it's, you know, creating a new drug for a disease or a methodology. We're seeing this also in, you know, obviously military gear and whatnot, as well as the telecom industry. So every industry is vulnerable to theft of intellectual property, but it's creating that trust-based relationship and having them understand vectors on how they can lose that piece to, one, arm them, you know, with the tools necessary to protect what they have, and then also help them be a good victim if that does happen. The other issue is obviously the academia.
Before we do that, let's talk about this good victim. Explain this term.
So, you know, what makes a good witness, right? So whether it's, you know, retaining logs or making sure that your firewalls are up to shape, you know, positioning a potential victim so they can provide as much information possible to help us identify who actually exfilled the information, or whether they are conducting due diligence backgrounds on individuals that are coming in and out of their space, or monitoring their network for, you know, suspicious downloads or whatnot.
And I know that the Biden administration has gone out of its way to sort of lay this out, best practices, what to do. Is this a part of the public-private partnership where the government's advising the private sector is advising the government? Who bears the burden of this?
I think it's a symbiotic relationship, right? If we have information on techniques and plans and capabilities, it's incumbent upon us to share it, but there's obviously that push and pull where we don't want to give the adversary an unfair tip on kind of what we know, but we also have a duty to, you know, inform companies on how best to protect themselves.
Okay, academic partnerships.
So academic partnerships is also an interesting rubric a nut to kind of crack. Because in academia, it's important to have that free flow of information, right? To invite folks with different thoughts and backgrounds into the academic ecosystem to be able to create and innovate. But the same issue is, you know, there's a trust-based model where academia, you know, comes together to develop capability, but the information also has to be protected in the same way, and that goes back to that vetting piece.
So would you say that these relationships with universities are on the uptick, or sort of, I mean, is that something that's going to grow, or is it something that you see as a constant and this is just another iteration of the same, or is there something new?
I think it's an increase of awareness. So we've always had good relationships with universities, and that's something that we always endeavor to try to continue. But in terms of, you know, being more transparent on kind of what we're seeing, you know, helping them be aware of ways their intellectual property could bleed out. I think that's an important part of the dialogue. And then also reassuring them with what our capability is, right? So when we identify an individual or perpetrator that steals intellectual property, they will be taken to justice.
I want to turn a little bit to the world stage. A lot of the focus in national security from the United States point of view for the last year or so has been Ukraine and the war in Ukraine. And I'm just wondering, how has this changed the security framework in terms of priorities, challenges, things that we're, orienting ourselves towards in terms of protecting the country? Where's the impact? Has it been largely in cyber, which we read, which we learn about? Has it been largely economic in other ways in terms of oil and food and supply chains? Where does this intersect with your work?
So I think I've seen it on a couple different fronts within the last year. One is the intelligence community ability to quickly turn information and operationalize it, and the requirement of all of the different partners to be able to kind of be open and transparent to a certain degree, but also try to protect kind of how they were collecting information. But I think that has caused us to rethink that sharing framework.
Interesting.
The other piece is obviously trying to figure out how to frame this. Dual-use items that we're seeing, avoiding sanctions, and I think that has been an interesting journey for us on kind of how that is mapped out, and what are other countries that sometimes these technologies or dual-use items are traveling through.
That's sort of interesting. And so because there's so many state actors that have some kind of interest in what's going on in Ukraine, in the Russian war in Ukraine. And so the question is, how much has it reoriented our relationships, and I mean on the law enforcement back and forth level with China, for example, and with other countries? How would you assess that? Is it, because you talk about partnerships and partnerships between countries, and I'm just wondering, does this come up, or is it just sort of business as usual, and then we sort of get to
No, it definitely does come up. The Chinese government is a very capable adversary, and they are leveraging all vectors into a particular country. So that partnership piece becomes even more critical. And then to your earlier point, that transparency piece, right? So providing the right amount of information, to a partner country to enable them to identify whatever that footprint, whether it's China or whatnot, that's in their country, whether they're, circumventing certain sanctions, or they're, pulling capability out of it. I think those are important things to remember.
And what about Iran? How has the challenge that Iran does or doesn't pose, after the JCPOA, we pulled out of it, and other things, where is this on the horizon, or is it something that sort of not quite front and center on how the FBI is thinking about things these days?
So Iran has always had an interest in that transnational repression piece that we had alluded to earlier. But in the recent year, it seems that they have become even more aggressive to committing a terrorist act on U.S. soil or in one of our partner countries. And I think that goes back to the partnership piece as well, as we are identifying.
So let me just pause here for a second. So this is something new now? It's sort of it's just kind of been a constant?
There has always been an interest in, quashing those courageous voices like I referred to earlier, within the U.S. But we are seeing now an uptick in a sense of urgency to actually do something like this. And it's very important to go back to, sharing this information, because nobody just stays within the four corners of the U.S. They, travel overseas, they're in these other countries, and it's important to try to share that threat information, because, our citizens are in danger.
So this is interesting, because you are actually describing a very quickly evolving situation, if not in terms of actually specific topics, then in terms of what the nature of the threat is. And so I guess the question is, in the challenges ahead, just thinking about them, let's spend a little time talking about what they are. Are there structural challenges within the national security community generally, and the FBI specifically? Are there structural challenges? Are there legislative challenges? Are there different issues that, and powers that are needed? Are there old ones that can be rejected? I know this is a very large question, but I'm really trying to get at, how the Bureau evolves to understand this new situation that you've described, and what are the actual, I want to say bureaucratic challenges on one level, bureaucratic, but also empowered. What is there that you need or maybe don't need at this point in time? How much has changed for 21st century law enforcement, both at home and abroad? And what needs to be done, and maybe what no longer needs to be in the toolbox?
It doesn't seem like anything is coming off my list of things I need to address.
I think that I knew that.
There's nothing coming off the list, unfortunately. But I think for us, we were very successful in creating those Joint Terrorism Task Force post 9/11, right? We were bringing all of the different agencies to bear to create that common operating picture, to leverage the different strengths and weaknesses of each individual agency and their authorities to do certain things. So we're now, starting to evolve that, whether it's on the cyber side or the counter-intel side, where we're bringing these task forces together and using the authorities of each. It's almost a best athlete sort of thing. I think that's going to be hopefully the recipe for success for the future.
Okay. Let's turn a little bit to domestic terrorism. Just, if we had time, I wanted to get to this topic, to what we refer to in the United States right now as domestic terrorism. Some call it political violence, some call it different versions of violent extremism. But in this global scenario that you've pointed out with all of the challenges, does domestic terrorism become something that's sort of, okay, we have an office for that, we do that, or is it part of the larger conversation? And to what extent do you think that the domestic terrorism challenge has been, is capable of being addressed in its current form, in terms of just, we know what it is, we know who the actors are, we understand what our tools are, and or is there a sense of we need more, fill in the blank?
Yeah, so that's hard. That's a hard space to be in, because, as you know, there are no domestic terrorism groups within the United States that are labeled as foreign terrorist organizations, because by the mere title, right, they're domestic. So what that causes us to do is to leverage different tools in the toolbox. And what I mean by that, we've got individuals in the U.S. Most recently that were interested in committing an attack, a series of attacks on a series of power stations in the Northeast area. And in order to effectuate any sort of disruption, we had to leverage standard tools. In this case, I believe the two of the individuals were prohibited possessors. And what I mean by that, they were not permitted, because of prior criminal convictions, they were not permitted to own weapons. And the fact that they were trying to acquire additional weapons gave us a tool to, no pun intended, to actually arrest and disrupt them. In terms of the international piece, though, we are seeing within the cyber realm, individuals coming online and coalescing around thematically common themes, whether it's accelerationism, which advocates the downfall of society due to tearing down some key critical infrastructure. We're seeing that not only on our shores in the U.S., but we're also seeing that overseas, in some of the European areas. These individuals are coalescing on online forums. They're identifying, through manifestos, tactics and plans on ways to effectuate that piece. And then also they're sharing, other propaganda pieces.
And is there a common ideology? I mean, are we talking about white supremacists, white supremacists? Are you talking more generally about all different kinds of, ideologically motivated things? Or has the focus really become just the white supremacist organizations, Atomwaffen, et cetera? So that there is kind of that foreign attachment here. Is that what you're talking about? Or?
Yeah, and we're seeing that present itself, not only in the U.S. but also abroad, with targeting certain communities, such as the Jewish American community, where they are calling for attacks, against synagogues, houses of worship, and whatnot. We're seeing, like we did up in Buffalo early this summer, where they are, going into a grocery store and mowing down, minorities. these are things that, are not only happening on our shores, but we're also seeing, them happen in Europe as well.
So where does this put us in terms of the fight against Al-Qaeda, ISIS, associated forces? Where does that exactly place it? Is it become, I noticed, how very few international terrorism cases related to jihadist violence are brought these days compared to hundreds over the past couple of decades. How low has this threat become in the larger scheme of things?
Well, in my portfolio, being overall the national security threats, that is still one that is front and foremost. Al-Qaeda still is very interested in conducting an attack, whether it's in the homeland or in Europe.
Yeah.
ISIS is still, intent on, inspiring online and conducting an attack, whether it's here or abroad or a U.S. interest anywhere. So those have not fallen off our list.
Right. And so and I just wanted to get to Al-Shabaab and Somalia because, the United States has upped its presence in its response to Al-Shabaab and other issues related to Somalia, and I'm just sort of wondering how that fits into the framework. Do you see that as a hub of what to focus on in terms of the international terrorist threat, or why do we see this new activity and this new level of interest, I would say, in Somalia?
I think as we all know, Al-Shabaab has always been there.
Yeah.
The reason why I think corporately we are more concerned about it is, our partner countries are, again, shifting resources, from one threat to another, whether it's,
And just so our partner countries,
So whether it's, France or England or whatnot, they are focusing their finite resources like we all have on not necessarily other high priority threats, but, they are moving into the counter-intel realm as well. So it requires us to be even more meticulous with our finite resources and drawing on those partnerships and increasing in-country capability.
which brings us back to our original question in terms of, human power, number of personnel, number of offices, number of authorities, and sort of the size and function of the FBI. And do you think that these partnerships have been used both with the private sector, with other countries, that they have been leveraged to the point where they need to be, or are there other partners that we should be thinking about that we don't actually have yet in the scenario? So, for example, the tech sector is a very important partner. But are there other sectors, are there other places for partnerships to develop that might, help with this, seems like vastly expanding portfolio of challenges and interests and concerns?
It's a loaded question.
I know, I'm sorry.
There's so much to unpack. Oh my gosh. So the short answer is yes, but I think the audience probably wants a little bit more than that.
Well, for example, a lot of past presidencies have relied on cultural relationships, sort of bringing things up to date in terms of not just the media, but beyond the media to actual culture, a sense of just sort of reaching out to understand what the conversation is. And I think the question is, are there positive and productive ways to do that? And is this something that's being thought about or not? Because a lot of this, an undercurrent of what you've been saying is a lot of this is public understanding. The emphasis on transparency, which was made by President Obama, but in the Biden administration, there have been a number of top officials who have said transparency, 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 and we have seen some signs of it actually. And the question is, are there other ways to sort of to instill an added measure of trust, reliance, conversation, interaction? And I think academia is one of them,
yep.
Which you've talked about. I think media is one of them. I think foreign security forces is another one of them. And I just wondered if there is something that we haven't touched upon. For example, in talking about economic threats, what about players within the economic sector? Is this like a category of outreach, or?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, I think venture capitalists, right? So, how do we increase overall awareness of kind of what is out there and what the second or unintended consequences of certain investment pieces are, while also being very mindful and obviously making them trying to balance kind of what their economic bottom line is. I think the more conversations we can have with key sectors like that, I think that'll increase that overall awareness and then bring everybody to the fight.
And you mentioned the JTTF before, and I meant to interrupt and just say, so what's happening with the evolution of the JTTFs? Explain this to us.
So in terms of the evolution of the JTFs, is the JTTFs are still strong and they're
Okay.
enduring. New York obviously being, at least I'm New York biased because that was my first office, being the catalyst of, how we do business with state and locals. And that also comes to play, which reminds me when we were talking about juveniles.
Yeah.
We're seeing an increase in minors that are being radicalized online.
So minors being under.
As young as 13,
Yeah.
Which is, shocking. It's not enough, and I don't think society would think that we are doing the right thing by arresting a 13-year-old. However, it's important, though, once we see an issue, we bring a whole of society, whether it's, school resources or mental health resources or state and local resources to kind of come to bear to hopefully help these youths that are basically very vulnerable to consuming large amounts of media online.
Do you think that we have enough of a movement that's built towards sort of what we used to call off-ramping before, this is sort of pre-off-ramping, and there have been other countries that have done this in a very aggressive way, the UK being one of them. But in terms of these minors, it's one thing to invoke school authorities, and another thing, I think many would think, to involve law enforcement officials. And so, do you think we're there, or do we need some kind of new thinking about how do we help these children? How do we begin not just to see where they're having trouble, because you mentioned in the COVID age contributing to that, there's been a lot of articles lately about the effects of COVID on tweens and teens, right?
Yep.
And what it's done to them, not in terms of nefarious things, but just what it's done to them psychologically to unearth them. So I'm wondering, is there talk about just sort of more attentive social welfare resources being put towards youth, both in the United States and elsewhere? COVID affected everyone and affected many communities of teens. Is there an impetus for that? Does there need to be an impetus for that? Where do we?
Yeah, I think
there
absolutely needs to be an impetus for this. There are several states around the U.S. that are doing it better, but it's not a one-size-fits-all, and off-ramp is probably not the right word,
No, it's not the
but
right word.
each case is treated individually based on an individual's background, the familial ties or whatnot. And, these are one of our most vulnerable populations, and I think corporately, society-wise, we could probably do more, whether it's, bringing in the right resources early on, whether it's having those, tough intervention conversations or offering them alternatives. But as you know, as we've seen in the UK, even those processes sometimes break down. And it's very easy to Monday morning quarterback or after action something to say, we could have done this a little bit better. But I think it's incumbent upon us, we owe that to the future youth, right? To be able to evolve and come up with that perfect rubric, which is going to be, individualized.
So I guess that brings us to the question of all of these problems, just when you're having this conversation, sort of lead you to, oh no, if it's not Iran or China or Russia or the war in Ukraine or cybersecurity or economic security or transnational aggression, all of these things, right? Repression. Where do we stand? Are we in a place where we should feel like, and I know this is hard for you to answer, but are we right now in the midst of trying to figure it out? Or are we at a stage of saying, we understand the complexity is the issue, we understand the complexity, and we're sort of working both internally and externally to handle that? And I mean that not as a question, but just sort of, where do you see the path of this? Are we at the beginning of a whole new way of thinking about doing things? Are we in the middle of a transition? Or are we basically just tinkering here and there with powers and agendas and solutions that we've had in the past and that we're taking forward? Take your time.
It's a great question.
Sorry.
So as you were asking the question, the first thing I was thinking is, oh my God, this is totally job security, because I think these threats are going to be enduring. However, I will also say, though, it causes us to be very agile, and that is something very difficult as a government agency. But it's incumbent upon us to assess, evolve, adapt, and overcome. If it was easy, we would have already solved it. And as we know, any of the topics we discussed today, they're very difficult and complex, and there's a multitude of issues. But I think it's incumbent upon us to each agency to look from within to see whether, are our resources in alignment, and are we constantly assessing and reassessing that piece? Are we leveraging the best technology that we possibly can? And is the funding where it needs to be? And then, are we putting those finite resources? Are we trying to be agile and shifting, highly trained agents, analysts, computer scientists, and we're recruiting and bringing that talent in to address, the Bureau's been around for over 100 years. What is that next 100 years going to look like for us? And, we need to be agile and adaptable. But as anybody knows about the federal government, it's somewhat like turning a battleship, on a dime. So it's important for us to be humble enough to realize that we don't have all the answers, to seek assistance from key partners, right, and get that feedback loop, and to also work with the American public to give us, to maintain the tools that we currently have and to identify new ones that we can bring in.
So one just follow-up question to that. When you say new tools, and because that was a great final thing, but let me just add this one. When you say new tool, one of the things that's become apparent in the United States and elsewhere is the sort of generational shift, right? You mentioned cybersecurity, that's just a name for so much that has changed technologically, right? And I guess, is there enough emphasis, or any emphasis, here and elsewhere around the world as you see it, on bringing in the younger, and I mean really younger, the out of college, even out of high school, if in different countries, generation, with the recognition that this is really something that needs to be a priority, that for all of the reasons, both technological, cultural, for the world changing, being born into a different world than others like you and me.
Not that we're old.
No, not us. But is there a sense, given what you've said about the different challenges, about the youth, et cetera, about bringing in, consciously bringing in younger voices, and a multiple sense of who needs to be in on the conversation, not just youth-wise, but in every other diversity way, internationally? Is this something that, and this I really want to know about the youth here, that's become either conscious or just happening? You can just.
So we are making we are making a deliberate effort to identify individuals, whether it's giving them aptitude tests while they go through new agent training at Quantico, or we are specifically recruiting individuals with certain technological backgrounds, or actually, and I would say, identifying folks within our current cadre that have displayed an aptitude and giving them that additional training to increase their overall skill set. And then the last bucket is looking at ways to retain the talent, because all of us join the government not to make buckets of money, and some folks are easily lured away by private sector dollars. So how do we balance that, right? So identifying new, young, bright folks, to your point, and bringing them into the organization, wedding them to a mission that is unparalleled, right? It's kept me in the organization for 26 years. And then also, training folks that have that aptitude within the organization and enabling them to use the skills that they're learning on the job, to completely further the Bureau's mission.
Larissa Knapp, thank you so much. This was a great conversation. I wish we can continue, but we're out of time. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.